Blazor routing is handled automatically by the router component. Developers can place @page directives in component files to specify URLs relative to the site route. URL parameters are also supported where parts are extracted from the URL template and passed to parameter properties of the Blazor component. In the upcoming demo, the routing mechanisms will be used to navigate between a data list view and an editing view. For editing purposes, several components are included in the Blazor libraries, and you'll see some examples. An extensible validation system with out-of-the-box support for data annotations is also available. All right, I'll start with a sample project that has a demo data layer in place. Here is the implementation that delivers a few rows of sample data and implements several utility methods declared in the interface iData layer. A list view is already in place that displays the data in a table. The dependency injection mechanism that provides the data layer reference to the page component has been demonstrated in a previous video. At the top of the component file, you can see the razor instruction @page, which defines the URL of the page relative to the site route. The file index.html includes a base tag, which is necessary for the Blazor routing mechanisms to work correctly. In app.razor, you find a block that instantiates the router component. Code is included by default that renders when a URL cannot be resolved. All right, back to the list view. Its routing URL is static, but dynamic URL parts are also supported. I'll introduce a component to edit individual data rows. And the list needs a new column for a link to that component. The URL is constructed using the row ID. I'll create a new page component to edit a data row and I insert some code. In the first line, you can see how the URL is parsed to retrieve a parameter value. The name ID is equal to that of the parameter property declared further down. It's also possible to receive parameters without type specification using string parameter properties, but it's a good recommendation to restrict the types where possible. When onInitialized is executed, the parameters are already available. In the sample, I use the ID value to retrieve an editable data object from the data layer. Note that you can include more than one parameter in a URL pattern. You can also have more than one @page directive for a single component, in case that component needs to handle more than one routing pattern. You may need to check parameter values to find out which parameters have been passed to the component via the URL. I run the application. In the list view, I click the edit icon for the first row, and the editing page comes up showing the name of the entry correctly. I go back and click the second row, and this also comes up as expected. With the routing configuration out of the way, I implement an edit form for the trophy type. Blazor provides several types for the form itself and a selection of editor controls. I assign Bootstrap classes to achieve consistent visual appearance. I build and reload the app and navigate to an edit page. As expected, it shows the row data in the edit fields. The edit form component provides a cascading value to its embedded elements. This value is the validation context for the data represented by the form. Out of the box, validation is supported using .NET data annotations. As an example, I edit the trophy type in my project and add an attribute to the name property. In the edit form, I add a data annotations validator, which is required to activate the support for data annotations. This is technically separate from the general validation functionality to allow for alternative implementations. At runtime, I edit the name field and remove its content. Validation kicks in when I tab away, and the edit field is marked red to indicate its invalid state. 2 additional components are included to indicate validation status globally or per field. In reality, I would just use one of the approaches at a time, but for the demo, I'll activate them both. First, I add a validation summary to the edit form. Then, I add a validation message for the name field specifically. At runtime, you can see that the validation error message is now shown in both places. As a final demo, I'll create a custom validation feedback component based on the Bootstrap framework, since the editors are already styled in the same way. I add a new component and call it Bootstrap Invalid Feedback. I begin by including a snippet that renders the required HTML. You can see the div block with the Bootstrap class name. This serves as a container for all current validation messages. Now, I insert code that implements a cascading parameter. This parameter receives the validation context passed down by the edit form. The mechanism of cascading values and parameters has been demonstrated in our component structure video. Since the feedback component will be instantiated for a specific field, I need a parameter to receive the field definition. The property for can be set to a lambda expression similar to that I used a moment ago with the standard validation message component. After all parameters have been configured for the component instance, I create a field identifier on the basis of the lambda. You'll notice that the type specified for the parameter for uses a generic parameter t. This has not come up in our demo so far. Blazor components can be generic. The type parameter must be declared using a razor directive. So I add this to the top of the file. And finally, I add the implementation of the helper function getValidationMessages. Now I can use the new component in the editing page. I add a line to show the Bootstrap invalid feedback right underneath the standard validation message to compare the output. I build and run, and now you can see how the Bootstrap styled validation status uses a smaller font and a slightly different color. To complete the picture for this demo, I add the final bit of functionality that allows a user to save changes made in the editing form or to cancel out of the editing process. To support cancellation, I need to navigate back to the list view. I add a razor directive at the top of the editing component to inject the Navigation Manager service. Now, I add 2 helper methods. Back to list uses the Navigation Manager service to navigate to the list view. Cancel is an event handler that I bind to the cancel button. Finally, I add the method validSubmit. The implementation passes the changed object back to the data layer for persistence. Afterwards, it calls the existing helper back to list. I configure the new method as a handler for the onValidSubmit event on the edit form. This handler is called once the form is submitted and validation does not return any errors. Now, in the running application, I can edit a row from the list view, make changes, and persist them. And if I start an editing operation and then cancel out of it, any changes are ignored. That's it for this video. Make sure to keep up to date with all of our YouTube content by subscribing and ringing the bell. Thanks for watching.